Hi, and welcome back to AMC. I'm your host, William Ford. Today I am talking with David T. Little, who is one of today's most compelling American composers, known for blending classical craft with the raw energy of rock and metal. His operas, Soldier Songs, Dog Days, JFK, and Black Lodge grapple with war, identity, memory, and modern myth. His newest chamber opera, What Belongs to You, won 2025's Best New Opera Award. He's the founding drummer of the ensemble Newspeak and currently serves as chair of composition at Mannes School of Music. Remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Also, we value your comments. Enter them below. Now, enjoy our conversation.
Hey, good to meet you again.
Good to meet you. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this.
Where are you located right now?
I am at home in Weehawken, New Jersey, which is just across the river from Manhattan.
Where were you born?
I was born in a small town called Newton, New Jersey, which is in Sussex County, the sort of northernmost part of the county. And I grew up in Warren County, which is just on the Pennsylvania border, the sort of northwest part of New Jersey, and which also happens to be the town where the first Friday the 13th movie was filmed, which I think it has turned out to be more of a formative, I think, than I realized at the time.
What was it like growing up there?
It was really good. It was quiet. It was at school with kids who were the kids of farmers. There's a lot of dairy farming going on there at the time. It's still there's still a fair amount. I went to the public high school there, which had a pretty healthy music program. My first year, it was a 7 through 12 school. My first year, the band director, Robert Bouknight, passed away, and he was much beloved. And then Stephen Zuccari came in after, and after a sort of initial period of adjustment, grew the program exponentially. So that by the time I left, the marching band and the jazz band were some of the biggest programs in the school. So it was a school where there was a lot of music happening, a lot of theater happening, a lot of opportunities to perform. Some of the first music that I wrote was actually writing drumline arrangements for the marching band. It was sort of one of the first opportunities I had to hear something that I had composed. And they were parts that went along with the music that the marching band was playing, but it was really thrilling to just have those opportunities. So it was an exciting place to be able to just try stuff, and played in rock bands, a couple different rock bands while I was in high school. I started playing drums when I was 8 in a town called Hackettstown, a fife and drum corps there that I happened to see in a parade. And I was also very interested in history, so this sort of Revolutionary War marching drum corps was really exciting to me. And so I started playing drums when I was 8. And when I was 15, I went to see The Nightmare Before Christmas. Music was already really important to me, but when I saw that movie, it sort of all clicked, that being a composer was this job you could have. The music, Danny Elfman's score, really resonated with me because I had also grown up doing musical theater and also grew up listening to sort of industrial metal and sort of dark music, heavy music. So that show kind of brought those two worlds together in an interesting way. It was a kind of a place for me in the world after that. And from that point on, it was all about composition. It hasn't
Right.
really stopped ever since.
What about your parents? Were they musically inclined?
They were, yeah. My father played guitar and drums. We always had guitar around the house. We had a drum set around the house, and I think that was one of the first things that got me interested, is just seeing these instruments around. And my mother was a dancer, so they actually met in college doing a production of West Side Story. My father was in the pit, and my mother was in the cast as a dancer. And so musical theater was really important growing up. We used to go to New York and would regularly go in and see musicals that were happening. I remember seeing Into the Woods and Gypsy and Ain't Misbehavin' and Phantom of the Opera, Les Mis, Miss Saigon, all the sort of big shows that were coming through, and some of which were sort of opening their runs around then. So I was exposed to a lot of music, a lot of different kinds of music, a lot of theater. My parents separated when I was, I guess, 8 or 9, and so at that point, then my mother and I would go and see a lot of musicals at regional theater. So I saw a lot of smaller productions of different shows, 10 different shows throughout the course of a summer. It became the sort of thing that we did. Also going to see movies. So I watched a lot of movies as a kid.
How did their separation affect you?
It was very difficult. I was quite young, so I didn't really quite understand what was happening. And I think it pushed me into, especially as I got closer to like 12, which I guess is when my father got remarried. That was when I sort of really got into sort of darker music and heavier music and heavy metal and industrial music. And I think sort of dealing with it. And Nightmare Before Christmas and then The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky score followed not long after. So there is this thread of this sort of intensity, the intense work and work that is very least not afraid of darker subject matters. I think at that time it was helpful for me to have a way of channeling what I was feeling.
You were feeling, was that anger?
I think it was anger. I think I was angry and I was confused about what was happening. And so I think being able to hear aggressive sounds was a good alternative to getting in a fight.
Or
I think it
smashing a
helped
wall or
me.
something?
Yeah, and I did some of that as well. But I think it did provide a really good alternative to a way to understand feelings, a way to process feelings. I think that's one reason why I've ended up in a way that was sort of training for working in opera and theater, where that's really my job. I have to articulate in sound the feelings of the characters on
Right.
stage.
And you went to undergraduate school?
Yep, I was a percussionist, playing drum set all through this time, and I ended up going to Susquehanna University in Pennsylvania. I started as a music ed major and then quickly kind of realized that wasn't quite for me. I remember we had a class where all of the music ed majors were given recorders and we were playing, recorders and just sounding like it was the worst sound I've ever heard, right? Like all these good musicians playing these little plastic recorders. And I remember thinking like, if this is what good musicians sound like, playing these things, like I don't want to be in a room of children with these like people who are just learning. I was like, can't. It was not for me. I do teach now in a university, and I think that the idea of education generally is something that I believe in and is important to me. But that particular subsection of it, I realized was not right for me. So I switched probably sophomore, junior year to being a performance major, undergraduate degrees in percussion performance. But I was taking composition lessons all through that time from, I think, sophomore year on, maybe even freshman year. And I was really, from the beginning, that was really my focus. There was a composition degree, but it was a BA, and I really wanted a Bachelor of Music degree. So I had something about having a music degree that felt really important. So I ended up doing the performance degree with a real strong focus on composition.
And then you got a master's degree.
A master's degree at the University of Michigan in composition.
Then you went on to get a PhD.
I was in Michigan for 2 years. I took a year off. I lived in Boston for a year and I played in some bands, wrote some music, and tried to sort of live on commission, which is some of my first commissions came about around that time as a piano trio, two piano trios actually, and some songs. And I was studying privately at that time with Osvaldo Golihov in Boston for that year. And then I started the PhD at Princeton, I want to say 2004, 2003, 2004. It was really important for my development, I think. When I was at Susquehanna, I had really good teachers, and I had teachers who were not ideologues. They were very open, and they really let me write what I was feeling. And so the works from that period, which are all now withdrawn, all my undergrad pieces are all withdrawn, but there you see my voice creeping in. I mean, there are certain chords that I was using in my first pieces that I still use. There's something just that I was in my sort of creative voice. But at the same time, I was trying to think about, how do you have a career in this? What does it mean to be a composer? So I used to go and read the sort of academic journals like Perspectives of New Music, which in that library were journals like Perspectives of New Music, which this would have been in the late 90s, early 2000s, and these were copies from the 80s. They had this notion of rigor and this sort of notion of coming from a kind of more modernist aesthetic position. And so I got in my head that that was what serious composers were. Like there was this struggle I encountered where I grew up listening to pop music. I grew up listening to, musicals and went to see like Willie Nelson when I was 15. And, I had a very broad listening experience and music that I really liked. And I got into this place where I think I kind of made myself believe that that was sort of unacceptable or that there was something that like we don't engage, like this is what we do over here and that stuff is over there, right? None of my teachers ever told me this. I think this was just something I absorbed by digging into the world of contemporary music at that time, or as it was 20 years prior from these journals, and trying to deducing what it was. And I think I wasn't incorrect in that there was a subset of the artistic world that felt that, but that was not the broader artistic world. So when I got to Michigan and Princeton, a lot of the work I was doing was undoing these sort of assumptions I had made as an undergrad. And so working with in Michigan, I worked with Michael Doherty and William Bolcom. Both of had grew up kind of in that world, but moved away from it. And then at Princeton, working with Paul Lansky and Steve Mackey and Dimitri Tomasco in the house that Milton Babbitt built. Paul worked with Milton and was friends with Milton. Steve also wrote his dissertation on Milton, and I knew Milton and I really liked Milton. We had really great conversations, and he was not the kind of ideologue I think he was portrayed to be. I think he's sort of treated unfairly in some ways. And so we talked about musicals in the 30s. You know, he had this whole other side of his musical life that he was passionate about. So for me, when I got to Princeton, especially, and at the end of my time at Michigan, there's a piece I wrote called Screamer, which is a sort of Ivesian collage of circus music, which I wrote with Bill Bolcom. And it was his very smart way of pushing me out of this ideological place and pushing me out of what he identified as a position that was not really me, and then pushing me into a place that was more me, that was a little more fun, but still had that sort of dark. I mean, Screamer ends up being kind of a dark piece in the end, but is also about clowning and things that related to my musical theater kind of upbringing. And then at Princeton, I remember I got there and I was very kind of edgy, and I kept talking to Paul Lansky about. I wrote this piece to kind of oppose this idea, and I wrote this piece to kind of oppose this idea. I had this confrontational energy, I think, in a way at the time in the work I was doing. And Paul, I remember in this sort of like very kind of Zen master way said, well, I think this is a good place for you because there's no one here to fight against but yourself. I was like, okay, challenge accepted, you know. And much of the next couple years was me really taking that to heart and saying, okay, well, who am I as an artist? Like, what do I really want to say? What do I have to say? What is the honest statement of myself as an artist? And I think two pieces, Soldier Songs and Sweet Like Crude, from 2006 to 2007, were the kind of first real statements of this shift that happened. And if you look at, there were pieces before that that are still in the catalog, Hope in the Proles, Sunday Morning Trepanation. They had a little bit more of a kind of modernist tinge, whereas Sweet Like Crude and Soldier Songs feel much more engaged with rock music, pop music. Sweet Like Crude is a power ballad for 8 instruments, love song to oil. Also starting to get into my political thinking at the time. And so that was a shift that happened. And then my life since then as an artist has been really one of kind of continuous searching and continually bringing in these different influences that have been, for whatever reason, neglected. 2008, I wrote a string quartet, confusingly called 1986, which is all about my experience playing in that drum corps. And because 1986 was the year I joined the drum corps, and it incorporated, it was a sort of collage, not collage, but it's sort of, it collaged ideas of quotation. It was based on my grandfather's clock, which is a song I played in drum corps, and then also incorporated into a string quartet the snare drum part that I playing my grandfather's clock in the drum corps. This sort of circular searching that I feel like I'm still sort of engaged in a way.
I read that you kind of got into looking at the cross pollination between music and politics.
Yeah, yeah. That was a big focus of mine. Still something I think about a lot. And it was actually what I wrote my dissertation on. So I have a whole 250-page document that I wrote tracing different approaches to, for lack of a better word, sort of activist music, politically engaged music from 1911 or 1907 through 2011 when I finished. And working through that was really important. The conclusions I came to were really important for me artistically. You know, there are a lot of questions when you get into the realm of music and politics. You know, questions of propaganda come up. Question, you know, like classical music is such an inherently sort of bourgeois construct. how can something from that world engage with the plight of the working class, for example? Right? You have all these sort of interesting dilemmas and conflicts that emerge from this discussion. And so I did my best to sort of dig through that. And the conclusions that I came up with, I think, still hold true, which is essentially, in a nutshell, that the approaches to political music that are most effective depends on the time in which you are living, whether they are revolutionary times or non-revolutionary times, and that those different types of historic periods require different approaches. And what has been interesting to me to witness, I finished this in 2011, during the Obama administration. I would call that a non-revolutionary time in terms of the way the work was being made and perceived. And I think that changed in 2016, and we entered more of a revolutionary time where the tactics that people were using have changed since then, which is very interesting. And one of my projects is to write a new chapter and since 2016 an analysis of what's been happening and then publish that as a book. So I don't know when that's going to happen. It's so big.
Is there a composer you think was fairly overtly political that we wouldn't consider to be political? Who would surprise us in your review?
Yeah, it's interesting. Who would surprise us? That's a good question. A couple composers come to mind who have sort of different approaches. That they're all fairly explicit, but in slightly different ways. So it's not really an answer to your question. I mean, Mark Blitzstein, Cornelius Cardew, Frederick Rzewski, and Louis Andriessen, I think, are really interesting examples. Louis, I think, for me, and Louis I knew, and Frederick I didn't get to know. I mean, Blitzstein died before I was born, I think, and I think Cardew as well. But you know, their journey, their path through a life as a politically engaged artist is very interesting, because their approach has also evolved. And you look at Louis Andriessen and the pieces like Workers' Union and the pieces he was writing in the 60s and 70s have a certain urgency. And that shifts a little bit later in life and becomes a little bit more philosophical. Frederick, a little bit like that too. Pieces like The Road, you know, compared to The People United Will Never Be Defeated, which is very sort of explicit. I mean, incredible pieces. All of these pieces are just amazing pieces. But in 27, I think you have this shift where this is now, it's no longer the worker, it's now the people, right? And so the focus becomes on the people as a sort of rhetorical audience. Then folk music becomes important. And then you have Charles Seeger and Ruth Crawford Seeger shift, Ruth's music away from her string quartet and these early pieces, and then shifting to collecting folk songs. So it's fascinating period. The 1930s, historically, I think just wild.
Right.
I could talk about this stuff all.
Right. When you're composing, who are you composing for?
It's a good question. I would say it's at least three people, ideas of people simultaneously. I mean, one is myself, right? I mean, I think we, as composers, we write the music that we want to hear because it doesn't exist, right? So we're writing in a way to feed ourselves. So I think first we're writing for ourselves as composers. I think we write music that we want to hear that we feel doesn't exist in the world. And when you write something and it works, it just feels great, right? So there's this sort of dopamine hit you get from that. But I think you also need to think about your performers. You need to think very carefully about what they can do, what is an unfair thing to ask, what is just the right way to push them, in certain ways. And then, of course, you think about your audience and the communication between composer through performer to audience. I think especially for me, working so much in music theater and opera, telling a story. And so I need to convey the emotional world of the characters in a way that the audience is going to connect with because we want them to feel something too. So it's all of those all at once, I would say.
Did notice that you did not include your peers.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. It's funny. I have a lot of respect for my colleagues, and I think, the world is full of some amazing composers. I try to hear their work and, teach with some amazing people. But I also had an experience when I was very young where I felt I had to sort of defend some of my artistic choices to some more senior composers. Not, they were still students, but like, the grad students versus being an undergrad or whatever. And I sort of made a decision then that I wasn't going to write for them, that I can respect them and appreciate them and engage with them as colleagues, but when it comes to writing the work, they're not necessarily the audience. There's a broader audience that is important.
There is this notion that composers during the 50s and maybe early 60s were actually writing for each other, not for the public. What do you think of that?
I think some probably were. I think there was a sense of, with musical rhetoric at the time, that music had advanced to a stage that was not understandable by the sort of common person. And maybe to an extent that's true. I don't know. I think there are a lot of so-called common people who would probably be into some of the sort of more experimental, absolute serial music or whatever, if they were exposed to it, but they're maybe not being exposed to it. So I don't know. I mean, I think there is a risk of being in a kind of bubble or being kind of a feedback loop, that I think for me, I got very lucky because early on I sort of made this decision. But I mean, I feel like growing up, I mean, I've lived you know, in New Jersey for a long time. And I grew up here. And since leaving Princeton, I've lived in Weehawken, which is separated from Manhattan by a river and separated from Brooklyn by another river, and I used to have this sort of feeling, oh, should I move to Brooklyn? Because that's where all my friends lived in Brooklyn. All this stuff was happening in Brooklyn. And I felt like, no, it's good to have a little buffer where I can really be who I am and not have to think about, again, this question of like, am I writing for colleagues? Am I writing for audience? Am I writing for myself? I've always felt like having that little a moat in a
Yeah,
way
gotcha.
has been good for me creatively.
Talk a little bit about the recent award that you won.
Yeah, so What Belongs to You was recently awarded the Music Critics Association of North America Best Opera Award, which is really quite meaningful. That project was really a labor of love. It was written for and with a group of really good friends.
And what was the
And
project?
it's an opera called What Belongs to You. It's a monodrama that I wrote for Kareem Suleiman and the Chamber Orchestra Alarm Will Sound, conducted by Alan Pearson. Alan also conducted my opera Dog Days back in the day and premiered my oratorio Am I Born? So we have a long history. And it is a 90-minute monodrama. It's one singer, it's Kareem, who carries the whole show, and he's remarkable. Um, it tells a story of an American expat, unnamed in the novel. We called him the American in the opera, and he is an American expat living in Sofia, Bulgaria, where he becomes obsessed, I think is safe to say, with um, a hustler he pays for sex in the park. And through this obsession, unlocks a lot of things about his childhood, about his relationship with his father, his very difficult childhood that the character had growing up in the pre-internet American South, as Garth would say, where being a young gay child was it's sort of impossible. Um, and the way this character found his way to a better place of being ultimately, but through this very difficult process with this character named Mitko. Um, and the way this character found his way to a better place of being ultimately, but through this very difficult process with this character named Mitko.
Uh, did he actually end up in a better place at the end?
I think he does. And we don't really go to the better place, but at the end of the opera, spoiler, he decides he can't save Mitko. He can't have Mitko in his life. He just needs to walk away. And that's what he does at the very end. And it's very painful at the time. And it's a very sort of sad moment. But I think that allowed the narrator, the American character, to live a life that would not otherwise have been possible. He was freed from this very destructive relationship that he was kept finding himself sort of stuck in or pulled back into.
Got it.
So I do
Did
think
you,
he ends in a better place.
throughout the development of the opera, did you work with with Garth Greenwell?
Did. So Garth was very generous and really gave me free rein to adapt the work. And so he sent me the Word file of the novel, and I adapted it directly from the text. I did the libretto myself. And, he was always available to answer questions. So I would ask him questions about, like, there's one scene where I imitate like crickets and katydids, and needed to understand what they would have sounded like in Kentucky where this scene was set. Garth grew up in Kentucky. So I would say, do they sound like this? Do they sound like this? What is this? So he was very helpful with that. And also just asking about motivation of characters and things like that. It's like people say it's great to work with a living composer because you can ask them questions. I kind of felt that way working with Garth. I could say, like, what is Mitko really thinking at this point? And that was really great. And then beyond that, he was fairly hands off in that he came to the workshops that we had, and he would say, like, I don't think this word's the right word. It got very sort of writerly, and it kind of functioned almost like an editor for the libretto from an intention point of view. He'd say, this word is not a word that I would use. It stands out. Because I was trying to distill the whole thing. I had to
Oh,
distill
sure,
this
sure.
novel down. I was condensing paragraph into a word in some cases. And so he would say, I don't know that. But really, beyond that, I think once he got a sense of what I was doing with it, once he got a sense, um, I think he was probably nervous at first because it's this work that he spent years writing, and then some other person he knew a little but didn't know necessarily well at that point, was kind of taking it and changing it. And I do think that the opera is different than the book in some ways. It focuses on different things. Obviously, it had to cut a lot. There's a lot that I couldn't include in the opera. Some of which I was very sad to lose, but it really it sort of had by necessity kind of streamlines the whole thing into a really not that the novel lacks a focus in narrative, because it does not. It's an exquisite novel, but it just was very streamlined. Um,
Novels can be very good at looking at the interior of the person and their experience. That's much more difficult to do in a staging of it.
it is, but also I think opera is the perfect place to do that too. Well, because you have arias. I mean, an aria is sort of that, right? The aria is like,
Okay.
here's you have the recit, here's what's happening, and then you have the aria, and here's how I feel about that. And so, and I think the trick is doing it with one character, because in an opera with multiple characters, you have conversation, you have dialogue. It's, I think, unique in that the character pivots between being the narrator and sometimes talking to the audience almost directly and saying, this is what happened, and then this happened, sort of the storyteller. And then it pivots, and then we witness him being in the scene that he was just describing, and then we experience a sort of aria moment and this sort of emotional revelation moment. So it's an unusual piece in that way, I think, because it does sort of, it pivots.
When you were faced with the blank page or computer screen or whatever, how did you start? Did you outline the whole thing? Did you just have it grow organically? How did that work?
It was a little of both. Because it was a pre-existing novel, right? The text existed, there was a story, there was an architecture that already existed. And so then my job was to pare that down and distill that down into a manageable sized opera for once. With multiple singers, it could be longer. I think 90 minutes is already longer than I think I thought it would be.
Yeah.
I think we were originally thinking 70 or so. And then it grew a little bit. But within that architecture, a lot of it was quite intuitive. And I would sort of work through every day the libretto. The libretto came first. I did the libretto for Act One, and then wrote Act One, and then libretto for Act Two, and wrote Act Two. So I did it sort of in chunks. And so sort of building on what had happened before. But really, it was very intuitive. I think one of the things I learned coming through that sort of that period when I was at Michigan and Princeton of really digging into who I was as an artist, challenged myself at that time to trust my intuition creatively. And I did in Soldier Songs in particular, I was very happy with how that worked. And so I've become very trusting of my instincts creatively. So there's not a lot of, I mean, there's charting and planning and there's things like that, but a lot of it is just like feeling your way through it and feeling like, okay, this section's too long, this section, and we need to get to this next emotional beat. And I think also trying to inhabit the emotional space of this character as much as I can. And that's true with I think any work of opera that I write.
Sure.
I don't tend to, I mean, we workshopped things, but it wasn't a workshop like often happens where people, I made a lot of changes afterward. I made a lot of small changes, but architecturally it was didn't change much. And that tends to be the case for me. Like once I see it, it tends to be pretty formed. And then there's not a lot of change that's needed
Got it.
usually, at least on the big scale. There are always little changing notes and things like that.
It was great talking to you. I could have talked to you for another half hour.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. It's great to
Hey, I
meet you.
appreciate it. It was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Great.
All right.
It was good to see you.
Bye-bye.
It must have been summer. My grandparents' farm. My father lay beside me. In a large field used as pasture. The air was cool as the ground released day's heat in long.
What Belongs to You is a novel in 3 parts, and the first and third part tell the story of an unconventional, compromised love affair between 2 men. The narrator, who's an American high school teacher living and teaching in Sofia, Bulgaria, and a younger Bulgarian man whom he meets. The middle section is distinct from that and tells the story of the narrator's childhood growing up in the American South. I wanted to think about certain kinds of sociality and certain kinds of particularly gay male sexual community that I think are seldom seen as being places of full and complex human value. Those are places that have been important to me in my own life as a queer person, especially as a queer person in the pre-internet American South. And I think they're places that allow for the full gamut of human feeling. They allow for tenderness, they allow for violence, they allow for intimacy. which is just to say that they're human places like any other.
It is a very interior story, so it is less about the events that unfold between them, although that's part of the story, but more about the psychological experience of that relationship. Garth's exploration of the mind of the narrator as he's navigating this very complex relationship reflects on aspects of balance and transaction and power that are to some extent, I think, present in all relationships, and that makes it very, very interesting. Fairly early on after the book came out, Garth and I started talking about what might an opera of this be like and who might do it, and how would you deal with having an operatic adaptation of this very intense one-character story. And we started brainstorming about composers, and David was someone who early on I brought to Garth's attention as someone who I thought could be a really great person to compose an opera for What Belongs to You.
I think the thing that I found so remarkable in the book was how much I did identify with. That doesn't necessarily mean that I have experienced all the things that the narrator experiences in the book in a literal sense, but I felt that I had experienced on some level nearly all of it in an emotional sense. Ideally, I think with a work of art, you want people to take from it what they need and see in it what they need and connect with it in a very deep, personal way. I like that idea about the piece, that it could be many things, that it is many things.
It was very clear to me that Garth's writing was really prime for this kind of adaptation. There is a sense of lyricism and of attention to rhythm and sound in Garth's writing always.
This is the third opera for solo voice that I've written. So this idea of a solo singer kind of changing perspectives as the piece progresses, something I feel very comfortable with. Sometimes he's speaking directly to the audience. Sometimes we're watching him experience a dramatic moment. You know, so there is this moment, there is a sense that who he is always kind of spinning.
I think that that's cool in a way to kind of like rethink these traditions of art song and opera and what is opera anymore. And I love singing songs, you know, I love approaching songs in that way of like creating a scene for people and really storytelling. David has definitely tapped into a sound world that feels internally tormented and also rapturous all at once. And it's clearly a character that has a really hard time expressing that. So then, you know, obviously we get a sound world that is pretty manic and wild and scary and all of those things and intimate. But at the end of the day, like, the onus is on us to create something that is for the audience, you know, not just for me or David or Garth.
You know, Garth and I went to school together, and I got to know Garth, you know, right as he was coming out of that experience of growing up in Kentucky. And so much of that experience that Garth was having earlier in our friendship of coming of age and dealing with that baggage is processed in the book. And so for me, there is a very personal connection to the material that I'm conducting in What Belongs to You.
David spent time learning about the history of friendship that undergirds this project. The fact that, you know, I have known Alan and many members of Alarm Will Sound for 25 years. The fact that Kareem and I were in the same voice studio at the Eastman School. And that DNA, which is part of the DNA with which I wrote the book, is also part of the DNA of the opera. And so I have had, listening to the opera now over the course of months, there is this very strange experience of hearing language that I put on the page many years ago now, and hearing that sort of through the musical prism of music that was central to my development as an artist 25 years ago. I mean, there is this vertiginous sense of kind of being shown myself and being shown things that I've made in a kind of radically new way.
17 against my tongue. Necessary nourishment from an inadequate soul.